This video offers a little mini challenge in Python, and our goal for this particular challenge is to make a simple addition calculator. So we're going to add some numbers. Before we can do that, I want to discuss a little bit about data types. I just want to make sure we really know what we're doing here. There are three native types I want to discuss, and in particular what they look like in Python, though most but not all programming languages have some form of this. So the first one we're going to look at is the integer type, and I have in brackets there, that's a fancy looking Z, at least that's what it's supposed to be, which stands for the set of integers. And those numbers are numbers with no fractions, whole numbers, but we're also including negative whole numbers as well. There are float numbers or floating point numbers, which you may not know what those are, but it's basically talking about real numbers, things with decimals. 1.3, that would be a float. And then strings are made up of characters. So it's like having a list of characters all together. If you have a bunch of letters kind of all together, and usually between quotation marks, that's what we do in Python anyway. You can have numbers in these strings, you can have spaces, you can have special characters, all kinds of things can actually be in there. Here's some examples. For the integer type, in Python, the way a variable gets a type is by assigning a value to it. Other languages, you have to explicitly declare what the type is. What Python does is whatever you tell it, it's like, okay, that's what it's going to be. So in that first one where you're assigning the value 5, the integer 5, to this variable called I, it's an integer because 5 is an integer. But if you have x equals 5.0, it assigns a float to that x because you have a decimal in there, and that means that this is a floating point number, a decimal number. And if you just want a string with a 5 in it, so I've got this variable called car5, and I'm assigning 5 in quotes. These are three different representations of what we in our brains know as the number 5, but they're three different things within Python and also in other languages. So to kind of illustrate this, I'd like you to try this in Codesters. So if you want, pause the video in a moment to actually try this. So you create first x equals 1 in quotation marks, y equals 2 in quotation marks. Then put in a print statement x plus y. And so print will display the statement that you tell it to onto the console. After you do that, try x equals 1, y equals 2 without the quotation marks, and then print it and see what happens. So go ahead, pause the video for a second and just try it. And when you're all set with that, you see your results, we'll come right back here. So pause now. Hopefully you've had a chance to try this, but if you didn't, I've got the code in this little area of Codesters right here. X equals 1 in quotation marks, y equals 2 in quotation marks. Print x plus y, then I took the quotation marks away in the same print statement. So you want to make sure before you run it that you're looking at the console, and in Codesters that means you have to press that little P, and it kind of peels away the Codesters stage level. And so let's see what happens when I run it. Okay, so the first print where I was using x as a 1 with quotation marks and 2 with quotation marks as well, so two strings, and actually puts those two strings together. We call that concatenation. If you know Scratch, this is like a join statement in Scratch where it just puts the two strings into one string. But when I took away the quotation marks, it actually added the two numbers 1 plus 2 to get 3. So when you're using the strings, it produces a string function, but when you're using integers, the Python knows that these are integers and it'll know to add them. The way you define your types and the way you define these variables with these types really affects what the code will look like. Okay, let's go back now to our slides. What happens when these types become incompatible? There are times like if you assign an integer into something that's expecting a string, it can be difficult. You can do this thing called casting, which converts types. So I've got some examples here of some casting functions in Python. Let's say you have the number 3.6, so it's a decimal. This is actually a float, but for whatever reason you need it to be an integer. There is a function called int, and you pass in floating point number. And so what it does is it's going to turn this into an integer. Now you have to be very careful because what it does is may not be what you expect. You may be used to rounding numbers. In our world, if I said, hey, 3.6, I want the nearest integer, we would say 4 because that's how we round numbers in mathematics. It's 5 or bigger, you round up, it would be a 4. But that's not what the int function will do. The int function truncates. And so what that means is anything after the decimal it just throws away. If you say int 3.6, it's going to return a 3. So it doesn't know to round. I think there's other rounding functions in Codesters and other places. You have to just know that when you're working with integers, that's what it does. This float function, so I'm passing into it an integer 1, it's going to return it as a real number. So it puts the 0.0 on it, now it's real. The string str function, I'm passing in anything. Doesn't matter what characters you put in there, it's going to return something, the same thing that you pass in, except it's going to have those little quotation marks around it, so it's a string now. And certain things require things to be strings, like the input statement and the print statement, and other things want things to be strings, so there's a way you can print out integers and floats and see what they look like, for example. But there's other things you might do with that as well. Now that we have that little bit of information, here's what I want you to do. I want you to make a simple adder calculator. So in Codesters, I want you to create a new project, and not yet. I'm going to give you time to do this all at the end. So let me just explain everything first. You will create a new project. Click on Projects and add the plus. If you're not using Codesters and just watching this video, just do this in whatever Python environment you're in. So I said call it Simple Calculator. I will say I called mine Python Adder because I thought it was funny to have two snake names up there, Python and Adder. Get it? But you can call it whatever you like, but this will be a simple calculator. So we're going to read through all the steps before we code. So step 1 is what you should always do before you begin to code, is like, what do I want this code to do? What should it do? And then how am I going to do it just at a very high level? What do I need to do? What is it supposed to do? It's a simple addition of any two integers, add two numbers, and those two numbers are integers. Now what I've got under it is my pseudocode. And with Python, a good way to do pseudocode is to just use comments, and you can type this directly into your coding area. The hashtag symbol or pound sign, whatever you want to call that, means I have a comment. So what do I do? So I think the first thing I'd like to do is tell the user, hey, this is a program that does something, and here's what you need to do. Inform them, give them some instructions, let them know what's happening. Then I need to prompt them to give me two integers. Then I need to do the actual function, which is to add these integers, and then I need to display the result. And by thinking ahead like this, obviously a very simple problem, but I have now commented my code before I even did anything. And I know for many of my students anyway, they hate comments. You just hate them, and you put them in at the end when you're all done. It's just you have to, because you'll lose points if you don't. The real use of comments is to use them before you do anything. So have them in place first, and then you kind of fill in, oh, what does happen here? What's the code that goes with that? And then you're all commented. That may be all the comments you need, depending on how complicated your code is, or how well you name your variables and how clear your code is. This may be all you need. So let's go through those steps. So the first thing we want to do is inform and let them know. I'm going to print out a line of code that tells the user what we're going to be doing. So here's an example of what you might say. Hey, let's add two integers. Step 3 then is, okay, so let's prompt them now. Let's look at what's going on here. You kind of start from the inside out. Sort of. I've got this variable x, and I'm assigning to it what? I've got an int function there because whatever gets returned back from the input function will be a string. Whenever you use the input function, enter the first integer, it returns a string and would put it into x, but I don't want a string, I want a number. So I'm using that casting int so that I know an integer is going to go back into that x value. And then I'm going to ask for the second number in the same way, assign to the variable y an integer, right? That's what this means. And it's the result of whatever comes out of this input statement. Enter the second integer, the user types in some number. It's going to turn it into an int and then store it in y. Now, one thing you have to be careful about is what we call data validation. What if they don't cooperate? What if they don't type in an integer? When you actually do this coding, remember to test that and see what happens. What happens if they don't put in an integer? Step 5, I'm actually going to define a function that actually does the meat of this project. And this is a very simple thing. It doesn't need to be a function, but I just wanted to illustrate that these are things you can do with functions, and I want you to start thinking about, well, sometimes it's good to do that. Just create a little function for things that you want to do, especially in the early stages. Functions are defined before you use them, just like variables. So when you write your code, you're going to have to put your function definition prior to any call that uses your function. Defining first a function I'm calling add two integers. And I have two parameters that I'm passing in, an x and a y. And I have my comment here. Add the two input integers and return their sum. Now, Here I put a little pass statement. A pass statement in Python doesn't do anything. And the reason I'm doing that, because I have a little comment right after that, I want you to actually add the code for that. It's a simple one-liner. But if you look at the next line, it says return answer. So in that statement where I currently have the pass, you're going to have to set that variable answer. And it's going to have to somehow be the sum of those two numbers, x and y. Set answer in the statement where I currently have a pass, and then return that value. So anybody who uses AND2 integers, it's going to return whatever is in the answer variable within this function here. Okay, once you've got that done, in your code now, we have the thing where we prompted for the numbers. Now I'm going to call that function, add two integers, that's defined prior to this, passing in the x and the y, the two numbers that the person typed in, and I'm going to store it in a variable called sum, or you can store it in any variable you want, but do make sure the variables make sense, tells what's happening. And then finally we want to print out the answer, what we got. Here is an example of a string you might want to print out. The sum of blank and blank is blank. The first two blanks should be what the user typed in, and then this last one should be what you got as your sum. The print function, which will be how you get this statement to come out, you're going to say print this string. You have to be really careful with that because only strings can be used. If you're using x and you're using y, you're going to need to use that str casting function around x and as well as around y and around sum, so otherwise you're going to get an error if you don't do that. So think about how you're going to have to use casting for that. So at this point, I think we've gone over all the requirements. We've really thought about our design and how we want our code to look. So I'm going to tell you to pause the video and give it a try. And then resume the video when you're ready to see a possible solution, not the possible solution, but a possible solution. Don't cheat, try it. Okay, go ahead, pause. Let's see a way to do it, and I'll show you one that I came up with. Okay, so here's my simple Python adder. Simple code to add two integers. There's my comment there. And so I put some comments up front so that anybody who looks at this file will know what it's doing. And here is my function that I defined, add two integers, x and y, that we talked about when we were designing this. Always put some kind of comment there. I'm just using a straight up Python comment here. We can talk about different comments that are typically used in functions with Python, but not right now. Not right. We're just going to stick with the normal comment here. So it's telling what you're doing. Add the two input integers. So those are my inputs, two integers, and return their sum. It's always a nice idea. What's the input? What's the output? This was the bit of code I wanted you to do on your own. So I'm going to take these input numbers. I'm going to add them. I'm going to store it in answer. And then I'm going to return answer. This on its own doesn't do anything. It's just defining a function. So when this code runs, the interpreter just says, oh, okay, I see you've got this thing called add two integers, but it doesn't do anything that the user can see at this point. But our next statement, if you look at the indentation, we're back all the way to column 1. It's not part of this function. Now I'm back in column 1, and I'm just going to print. And we're going to print, let's add two integers, and probably sufficient here, but you could say other things too. Then I'm going to prompt for the integers to add. This is that statement that we saw in our design. Input, enter the first integers. Input meaning I want the user to type something and I run it, return it to this variable x, but I need it to be an integer. And y is the same thing. Give me a second number. And then we're going to add these two things. So now I'm going to call that function that I defined, add two integers, x and y. I'm going to store it in sum. And then I'm going to display the sum. So I think if you had problems with it, it might have been this statement. So here's my first bit of string, the sum of, and there is a space between the of and the quote so that when I print out the actual numbers, there's a nice little space when you read it. So x, I can't just say the sum of plus x. X is an integer, and it doesn't understand how could you put an integer in with a string? It doesn't make sense. So I'm going to turn it into a string so that it will concatenate or join them together. Then I'm going to add another literal string, and there's spaces in front and in back of this word and, so that the next thing that prints has a nice space. Take y's value, which is an integer, turn it into a string so that it'll print. Is, again, with spaces before and after so that it'll format nice. Now I wanted to put it on the next line because when I was first looking at this, it just looked too close together, and I thought it would be a good place to just show how you do this. You can, in a logical place, you can put anything on the next line. So I put it right before the plus. I don't have to. I could have put it right there if I wanted to. When I first was coding this, it was all cramped and I couldn't see it, so when my window was a little closed, I did it that way. That's just how you could extend to the next line. That's perfectly legal. But again, I'm making a string out of my sum. So I want to see what this looks like. Since I'm using print and input. These are console functions. So I'm going to make sure I'm looking at my console. The little cursor there kind of gives you the clue that's where you are, and I sure hope this works. Let's try it. So I'm going to press my thing here. Okay, let's add two integers. Enter the first integer. So let's see, I'm going to put a 3 in. Enter the second integer. How about 5? And then it says the sum of 3 and 5 is 8. Well, that looks pretty good. That looks correct. I don't really like how it's not skipping space. It looks a little too close, and I don't know if you know about this. If you put a backslash, so the one that looks like it's going down, right, and an N with a space or without a space, that actually adds a new line. So I'm going to put that in front of these to see if it just formats a little bit nicer. That's kind of why we run. We just want to get an idea of what does it look like. Can I make this look a little better? And let's see if it does. And plus I could try other numbers, make sure that wasn't a fluke. So let's see, 10, see how it's skipping a line? Enter the second integer, about 50. The sum of 10 and 50 is 60. So to me that looks pretty good. So now you learned a new thing about new line if you ever want to put spaces, and you can put that anywhere in the string whenever you want a new line. There was a test requirement within the design that we looked at. It's like, this is great when you have integers, it works fine. Let's see what happens if we enter something that isn't an integer. So enter the first integer instead of a number. What if I just say, hello there? It blows up. I get this terrible error. You never want to see this in your code. So what's happening? It's kind of cryptic. Invalid literal for int with base 10. Hello there on line 17. And it's trying to say this is where I blew up. So check this part out. And it's basically saying, hey, int base 10, so it's numbers, right? We're looking for our nice decimal numbers, but we want integers. And what did we type in? We typed in a string. We don't want a string, that's the wrong thing. The int is blowing up because it's expecting a number and it's getting that. Data validation is kind of important here. We can make this work. If this was something I wanted to give to the outside world, I would have to really check for all that. If it was something I was just using for myself, maybe that's okay. I know to type in the right thing. But if you're anything that you have a product that anybody else is going to use, you have to be aware of that. That's just a quick example. Yours can look different and still be correct, but just wanted to show you mine. Okay. So hopefully you got that to work, and if you did, that is fantastic. And if you didn't get it to work, hopefully you know why. I would like you to see if you can add to this. Can you make a calculator that subtracts, that multiplies, that divides? And so you can do this all with similar code, and you could make 3 separate projects, but maybe can you figure out how to do it in one program? One possible way to do that, I'm giving a little hint here, is maybe you ask the user, well, what is it you want to do? Do you want to multiply? Do you want to subtract? Ask them maybe, and then you'll know which function you need to run. Give it a try just to get a little practice. And once you're feeling comfortable, I have just a final thing you might want to try, which is, can you make another project called miles to kilometers, or whatever you want to call it. But what it does is somebody types in a number of miles and out pops kilometers, and maybe vice versa if you really want to get tricky. Just to try it. Anyway, I hope this was helpful. I hope you learned something. Thank you for watching, as always.